Willow Creek Springs presents Healthy Living with your host, Joe Grumbine.
All right, here we go. Sorry about that. Hello and welcome to the Healthy Living Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Grumbine, and today, gosh, usually ask how to say your last name. I hope I don't butcher this. I have a very special guest today. His name is Sonny Garg,
Okay.
and did I
You
say that
got
right?
it. You
Okay,
got it.
beautiful. All right,
There you
well,
go.
and Sonny's got quite an interesting story. He's a former Fortune 125 C-suite executive with over 30 years experience examining conventional thinking to transform mature organizations and build new ones across private, public, and nonprofit sectors. He is distinguished executive in residence at the University of Chicago, Booth School of Business, a White House Fellow, and an Aspen Crown Fellow. He holds an MBA and a BA from the University of Chicago and an MPP from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. But he's got a new book out, Desi 2.0, My Family's American Dream and the Cost of Never Being Enough. And I think that title alone gives us a place to begin this conversation. So, Sonny, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Joe. Really appreciate it. Look forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. I love having authors as guests because usually you've had a moment to get your thoughts together. And it's not just going back into your memory and try to remember, how'd you get here? But generally, I like to start a conversation with, tell me a little bit about how you got to this place. It sounds like you had quite an interesting story.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And it's such a, yeah, it's an interesting question, right? Because we all need narratives to make sense of our lives, right?
Sure.
And so part of the question that sort of underlies the book is when do those sort of inflection points come? I mean, certainly there are times in our lives that are sort of structured, right? Our birthdays, anniversaries, New Year's, where we take a step and, oh, what's going on? And is this something, where's my life and where do I want it to go? But
Right.
for me, the big impetus for the book came about, gosh, now almost 13 years ago. I had just been named to the executive committee of this Fortune 125 company called Exelon. I was having lunch with an old pal of mine, and he was very complimentary of the fact that, wow, you're on the executive committee of this big company. And I looked at him, and unexpectedly, I just said to him, I said, my life sucks.
Oh, no.
And, and he looked at me kind of quizzically, and he said six words that really began the journey that ended up with this book. He said, what are you chasing and why? And, I had like read all those books about meaning and a life of meaning and Aristotle and all that other stuff. And for
Sure.
whatever reason, those six words just stuck in my head. And so that's really, the book is really just an outgrowth of trying to answer that question, not only for myself, but to pose questions for others, right? To be able to say, for all of us, what are we chasing and why are we chasing those things? And who told us those things are worth chasing? And how does that affect how we think about ourselves, right?
I
And
love
is
it.
the chase, how tied is, for me, the chase was all about achievement. It was all about the next rung on the ladder. My
Uh-huh.
my parents were immigrants from India, and the idea was like, hey, they came here, and I'm gonna, you're going to Harvard, and you're gonna be a success, and you're gonna be a physician, and so your identity gets caught up in your achievements, and not
Right.
just that, but your sense of self-worth gets caught up in your achievements, and then you're only as good as your last achievement.
Yeah, what
And
have you accomplished lately? That becomes kind of a haunting thought.
exactly. And then you're stuck in comparison trap. You're stuck in, never feeling good enough. And that's why the subtitle, the cost of never being enough. And so that
Right.
was, I wrote it both for myself to help me kind of make sense of decisions I made and why I chose paths that I chose and forks in the road. And part of it was to sort of, really the bigger part really was to catalyze for other people who might read the book a set of questions around, what are they chasing? Why are they chasing those? And who told them those things were worth chasing? And, where do you draw your sense of self-worth from? Right. And so,
Absolutely. So you heard those six words obviously you probably didn't sleep too good that night. You were chewing on that and processing it. What did you do next? Like, what were you chasing? What and
Well,
why?
yeah, no, I mean, it's a great, it took me a while to figure it out, but well, so the first thing I did was, what type A high achievers do is they go to try to figure out and solve the problem as fast and easily as they can, right? So
Sure.
I write in the book a little bit about getting trapped in what I ended up calling the happiness industrial complex.
Okay.
Like, okay, well, do these six things and everything will be great. If you meditate in the morning and take a cold shower, and if you maybe do a cold plunge and all those sorts of
Sure.
things. And
Yeah,
all those things they have value in and of themselves, but
absolutely.
really, but you're trying to optimize you have to assume, it assumes that you're optimizing something that's worth optimizing.
Right.
And part of what I discovered, was that just what I come to call Desi 1.0, which is the programming, sort of like the way I was programmed was just not a healthy programming, right? It
Okay.
was, my father grew up very poor in India. My grandfather worked on the trains in the British Empire. And so
Hmm.
for my dad, achievement was a way to show the world that you were worth more than they thought you were worth,
Right.
right? Because he had been so dismissed, not only by the Brits, but also within the caste system of India.
Oh
And
yeah.
so,
I have no idea what that's even all about.
yeah. And so,
Right.
it was like, hey, show the world that you're better than they think you are, right? And so
Right.
that was sort of the trap. But that was the programming, all done in the best of intentions, but really creates this never-ending cycle of the next achievement. And so for me, it was like after I realized that it was a deeper sort of misalignment, and I didn't know and I was chasing just what I was chasing was validation and
Oh,
recognition,
okay.
and, I wanted people to tell me I was great, and so that's, Harvard tells me I'm great by letting me in, right? The White House
Right.
fellow says, hey, you're special. This
Yeah.
company says, hey, you're on the executive. And so I'm constant, but you basically have turned over your entire sense of self to others to decide for you what's worth doing and to validate that. And so it was really coming to a clear understanding that, that the gift my father gave me was agency to choose, and I needed to be more thoughtful about what I was choosing and why I was choosing those things.
Hmm.
And B, that, I needed to start separating my sense of self-worth from my achievements.
Oh, absolutely. So at this time, I know you say you were basing your self-worth on these achievements, but if you were to sit, like you said, and meditate or whatever, have a moment inside your head, did you feel what did you feel about yourself truly? Like, did you feel like you were okay and
No, no. I mean, I think that's why luckily I was having lunch with that pal, and we had a very good, we'd come through a program together, which was really based upon sharing stuff that you normally don't share with people,
okay.
right? And so that was a gift. And, when I said my life sucked, I think what I was saying was that the life I had built just felt empty. I called it in the book, I called it my David Byrne moment,
Okay.
where you sort of, if you remember the song Once in a
Yeah, yeah,
Lifetime, I
yeah.
talk,
This is not my beautiful house.
exactly, this is not my,
Oh
like, well,
my
how
God,
did I, how
what?
did I get here?
How
Right.
did
And
I
so that
get
was sort
here?
of that thing. It was just like, well, how did I
Right.
get here? Where I have from the external perspective, I sort of ticked all the major boxes. And if anybody's looking at me externally, they're like, wow, you're really successful. You got
Sure.
great career, all these great things. You got your family looks like they're fabulous. It's basically, it's what people show themselves off on now social media. It's the best of ourselves, but it's
Right.
not
Oh
necessarily,
God.
it's not necessarily the true self, right?
Right.
And the true self just felt like this wasn't who I wanted to be in the world. I just didn't feel good about myself. I wasn't the dad I wanted to be. I wasn't the husband I wanted to be. Even at work, you know, it was, the higher you got, the more you got sort of separated from the people who actually did the work, the more you sort of start commoditizing people in your head.
Mm.
When you're a $30 billion company, people become, we use the words like instead of not even FTEs full time, we do belly buttons, right? I mean, it was just sort of like, and I was like, this is not who I want to be in the world. But I didn't quite know who I wanted to be, but I knew
Okay.
that wasn't what I wanted to be.
So, you ever spend time by yourself at that point of your life where you just went for a walk or
Yeah, yeah. So I spent a lot of time then really just examining, it was a combination of yeah, one of my favorite authors is this theologian. His name is Richard Rohr. Oh man,
Okay.
can you hear me? Okay, I had somebody
Yeah,
outside
yeah.
just a
No, you
second.
sound fine.
Okay,
Yeah.
Richard Rohr, and Rohr talks about entering liminal space where
All right.
there's periods and times where the things that were dissolve, and you have to let yourself kind of have the grace to let yourself enter into a space that will reveal itself, but you have to give it time, right? And so that
Yes.
was the
Typical
first
time
thing. It
at
was,
Walden Pond, right?
yeah, exactly. So, it was like, okay, well, I'm not going to solve this thing by doing these three, meditations or whatever, right? I
All
really
right.
need to dig a little deeper. And so it was really then what I term in the book, and using sort of a software analogy, because I'm Indian, I guess I need to talk about software.
Sure.
But yeah,
Why not?
but we I kind of came up with the notion of a minimally viable me, right? Like a minimally viable product. Let's start with, like, what's the core of who I want to be, and let's figure out, like, let's build from there instead of trying to define the end product. Let's just start, well, what are the key features and functionalities that matter, and let's see if we can build a life that starts there and kind of grows from there.
Okay. And what did you come up with?
Well, I came up with a number of things. The first thing was that I wanted to be at home with my kids more. I wanted to
Right.
be, I felt like I was missing out on their lives. They were going to be entering high school, and I felt like I wasn't the kind of dad I wanted to be. And so,
So
really,
when
so
you
a
spend
key,
time with your kids, did that bring you joy? Like I always look at
yeah. Oh my
things like,
God.
where do I find joy? Where's that
Well, that
at?
was the thing. That was the thing that was the most important. Like, what do I want to anchor this in? What am
Sure.
I going to tether myself to? And it was, I mean, just spending time with my wife, and we had two girls,
Nice.
was the best thing. I mean, that's where I got the most joy. And what I
Okay.
realized was that, I needed to, that for me at least, that the joy um, came, and what people call quality time
Mm-hmm.
came from quantity. That I couldn't program like the rest. You're programming meetings, and you're programming meetings, and you're programming all that kind of stuff, but you can't program quality time with your kids, right?
Right.
And so I think that's really where I
I
ended
mean,
up.
to
So
a
I said,
little point, you can, I guess you can plan vacations
you
and
can. I mean, but as do you
the
have kids?
actual time. Yeah, you're right. It's got to happen. You got to do it.
You're just hanging out, and something
Yeah,
funny happens, or something insightful, or something meaningful, and they're
exactly.
just like, oh well, shit. Let's talk about that. Sorry, am I
Right.
allowed to cuss on here? You
Yeah,
know,
we're
you
we're
know, the
kind of
big,
PG-13 here.
okay, good. So you're able to, it's just those unexpected times of, like, you can't schedule those. And so, for me, it was like, okay, well, how do I do that? And then the biggest insight that came from that, and the biggest challenge became, okay, well, how do I live the lifestyle I'm living and have time with my kids? And so
Hmm.
the big change in that minimally viable me was, hey, maybe I don't need to be making as much money. I mean, the big question that sort of revealed itself, and it sort of came out of this short story by Tolstoy called "How Much Land Does a Man Need?"
Okay.
Which is like, well, how much is enough? Like,
Right.
how much money do I really need? How much
Right.
stuff do I really need? So my wife and I sat down, and we're like, okay, well, us to live a comfortable life. And again, this wasn't a life of, I wasn't taking a vow of poverty, but,
Right.
you
Right.
know, and it was significantly less than what I was making as a corporate CEO. I mean,
Okay.
C-suite guy, right? And so I said,
Yeah.
fine, let's go. I'm going to go and take a job that pays me less, but gives me more time with my kids, and still a job that's interesting, right? And so
Uh-huh.
that's what I did. So I left corporate America, and I went into an early stage company that you would think you'd be working a lot harder, but there was a little more flexibility. I was working hard, but I could be home for breakfast. I could be home for dinner. I could be home with my kids, right? And so that was the real goal. But it was really the understanding, going back to what you were saying earlier, was like, understanding, okay, the minimally viable of me wants to be a better dad and husband, which means I want to be around a lot.
Right.
And then that required me to reimagine and rethink things that I was chasing. And I said, okay, well, I don't need to be chasing more money. I can be chasing, enough money, right?
Right.
And
Absolutely.
and that changed everything. I mean, then things just fell into place from there, and then life got a lot easier and simpler. Then I was just like, well, I'm not going to go to, when you're a C-suite executive at a big company, particularly in a town like Chicago, you're a civic leader, and you're going to galas, and I'm like,
Right.
I'm not going to galas anymore, and I'm not going to do that kind of signaling of importance, right? And so
Absolutely.
once you sort of stripped all that away, I had so much more time and so much more options in life. And, going back to the idea of it really was recapturing my own agency and saying, hey, I'm gifted. Like my grandfather, again, worked in the train stations for the British, right? He didn't
Right.
have choice. He didn't have
Right.
agency. I went to freaking Harvard. I had choice. I had agency. Like go use it, buddy. And
Yeah,
so, and sometimes that's questioning the very things that you think you're supposed to be and saying,
exactly.
no, that's not who I want to be. This is who I want to be. And,
I love it.
the other piece you were mentioning, taking long walks. So certainly there was a lot of this that was in the context of time by myself, but a lot of it was in community, right?
Uh-huh.
There's a great social psychologist. His name is Kurt Lewin, who talks about behavior as being a function of person and environment.
Okay.
So part of this was to change the environment I was in. It was not only just changing me, but it was changing, the people I hung around with, people who
Sure.
wanted to be, so maybe I wasn't hanging around with the billionaire class and that's okay because
Right.
you had to find people that were sort of aligned with how you wanted to live. And so it was really,
Exactly.
and so it was just a really,
Isn't it
um,
interesting when when you change your values a little bit? And by that I don't mean, what's right and wrong, but what's important. Everything else seems to kind of come into alignment. Like when you really do it and you notice things like these people you want to be around rather than these people you should be around,
yeah.
and where you're spending your time rather than where you should be spending your time.
100%. I mean, I talk a little bit about it in the book, but there's a professor at University of Chicago Business School named Harry Davis, really wonderful, wonderful human being. Harry's probably in his 90s now,
Okay.
and he was a leadership expert, but he always talks to the students about their shoulds. He
Yeah.
goes, you got to, he goes, I should make this much money. I should do this with my life. And he's like, you need to write those shoulds down and then you need to challenge those shoulds,
Right.
and we're all sort of, whether we know it or not, as we are growing up, as we are learning, as we're being formed, we are learning we are accepting a set of shoulds that maybe sometimes we don't question. And
Yeah.
so part of this is the challenging of those shoulds and the unlearning of what you've learned, not because it was in any way necessarily wrong, but it may not just be aligned with who you are. And so, what I tell the business school students is, I've got an executive in residence there, is your whole life has been about the what and the how, and
Right.
a lot of the what's been defined for you. Well, what should you do? You should become a consultant or a banker, and you should make this much money, and you should have this, and your kids should go to these private schools. And so
Sure.
you've spent your life mastering the how. How do I get there? Well, I got to get the
Right.
right ACTs and the SATs, and but you never ask yourself,
I
why
get
do you
the
want
why.
those whats?
Yeah.
You've just accepted them.
Right.
And then at some point in life, going back to the idea of these inflection periods, something happens. Either you got a friend like I did, or later on I had something even that kind of was a different inflection point that was even took me deeper into this sort of journey. But you have to make time to ask yourself these questions. Otherwise, inertia just takes you in a direction, and you end up, like I said earlier, at your David Byrne moment, and you're like,
Right.
man, how did I get here?
Exactly. And it's unfortunate most people when they have that moment, it comes after some kind of major challenge,
Yeah.
a health issue or an addiction or a relationship falling apart or whatever it is, that big thing that you can't really swallow down. And then you ask the question when, you know, it's maybe better suited to ask it while you're in the middle of it, right?
Yeah, and I mean, and I think that's the question. That's the hard thing is, how do you do that? How do you make that a practice, or how do you begin to do that in a way that, that's honest? Because it's so much easier just to go along, right? I mean, you just
Right.
sort of, because, you're like, well, maybe this isn't everything's not great, but maybe I'll just make a few tweaks here and there, right? And so sometimes, yeah, you need these external shocks to the system that
Yeah.
that awaken you, right? And I don't think that that's, as you're saying, that's not unusual, right? I mean, that's just a part of the human condition. Otherwise there wouldn't be all these stories about people who have some kind of health issue or relationship breakup that makes you reimagine. I think the hard part is I think we all have those moments. The question is do you embrace those, and then do you sit with the discomfort that comes in unwinding it, because that's
Absolutely.
really, we all have those moments of like, shit, this may not be what I want to be doing. But then the question is, am I willing to live in liminal space and challenge things that supposedly make me comfortable, but maybe are making me uncomfortable?
Yeah, and there's a whole conversation about comfort and the value or lack of thereof of said comfort, but that's a whole nother conversation. I in the notes that I have about you, I have a bit about 2019 where you did go through a health challenge. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So, like I'd mentioned in 2013 is when that buddy posed those 6 words in that question. And that led me to 2 years later, leaving corporate, going to an early stage, reorganizing my life really around my wife and kids and trying to be less of what I call in the book, an addict to achievement,
Hmm.
and to the point where, I quit all these fancy boards and all these other things. And even when I went over to the startup, I told the CEO, I said, I don't want a title. I don't want an
I want to
office.
be
I
in
don't,
charge of anything.
yeah, I'm like, I don't, because all that shit is just, it's like a drunk walking into a bar. Like,
Right.
I can't, I'm not
Oh
ready
yeah,
to walk into the bar yet. Like, it feeds my worst, parts of myself.
sure.
And, but once my kids were already going off to college, I started reverting to that achievement thing.
Okay.
And, got to the place where I was just completely over, I was working all the time again, and I was hopped up on like, nitro coffees and stimulants and like, and my body just basically said, you're an asshole. And,
Isn't it
and
funny how that happens sometimes?
yeah, and you're not listening. And I had a seizure and,
Oh
I
boy.
at work and ended up fracturing my T7 vertebrae. And,
Thanks.
it really it brought home to a deeper degree what I had been thinking about for the prior 6 years, but really not really, really, going a little bit deeper and a little bit more honest with myself about, still being tied into my sense of self in terms of these big achievements. And so that was sort of, the second sort of stage of the transformation, let's just call it, or the beginning of the transformation.
That's your 2.0 there.
That was a big 2.0, and in the book, the other piece that sort of underlies the story is, there's one is obviously this achievement, but the other one is trying to be a good son, to immigrant parents. And my parents were, had a lot of challenges in their upbringing. And so they weren't the most, there was a lot of dysfunction, let's just say, in our house.
Mhm.
And so really trying to reconcile what it meant to be a good son to people who really had trouble being kind to themselves, right?
Right.
And so I think that was the next piece of sort of realization of how I sort of was living my life in a way I wanted to redirect it and reimagine it.
Hi, this is Joe Grumbine, and I wanted to share an update. The platform that hosts this podcast has made some changes to the subscriber settings, and we have a number of subscriber only episodes that we offer to the supporters. And for a minimum of $3 a month, we can get you signed up. And if you're already signed up and you're having some kind of trouble locating these episodes in the other platforms, I would say maybe the best answer is to unsubscribe and then resubscribe. I'm sorry for the hassle. I don't have any way to make a change, but I'm very grateful for all the support. Thank you. So, what was your next move? You get out of the hospital and you've got yourself together. You're recommitted to your program. What happened next?
Well, one of the things that I write about in the book is I was in the hospital and, I was less than a mile away from where my parents lived and they never came to visit me.
Oh wow.
And so it was a really difficult, it was the sense that I was trying to live my life for, whereas maybe before I thought about it as achievement, I was trying to live it to make them happy.
Hmm.
Right. And I needed to kind of disconnect from my sense of happiness from their happiness, right? Because they weren't going to be.
Right. Some
They'd
people
grown up.
just don't want to be happy. Yeah.
Yeah, and they'd grown up in such a harsh, different world, and they couldn't get themselves there, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that was the piece. Like, I can't be, I can't be responsible for their happiness. I can
Correct.
do what I can to support them, but I can't be responsible. And so
Right.
I think those types of things. And then I've just tried to rebuild a life that, is around that, trying to slow down. I'm actually wearing a t-shirt right now that says live slow,
Nice.
and
Love that.
you know, and I just like, yeah, just try to eat, you just try to be more, you just try to go into what you said earlier about, when you recognize there are certain values, how do you reorganize your life around those? So I tried to
Yeah.
just say, okay, well, how do I reorganize my life around, a life of humility and a life of gratitude and a life of
Yeah.
compassion and a lot, and
All that
and
stuff they talk about in the books, but doing it,
all this, but
you know,
it's really, well, because because doing it is letting go. I love Joseph Campbell, the guy who wrote,
sure.
Hero with a Thousand Faces, and
Uh-huh.
came up with the hero's journey, and he said, like, life is about slaying the dragon of the ego,
Right.
and it's hard, man. When in our society, so it wasn't just, part of the book is, yeah, it's certainly directed at immigrant kids and families, but our society is, it's a consumer materialistic driven society that you introduce yourself by, how much shit you have and
Yeah.
how much and that's just that
I
it's
think
all
George
ego.
Carlin did a really great bit about that.
Oh, did he? Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
like it's
pay
all
for your
ego, right?
stuff. Yeah, all this stuff. Yeah. But
Yeah.
yeah, you're right. It's so prevalent. It's ubiquitous. You
You
just can't get away from it.
you can. And then in the age of social media, it's even
Oh,
worse, right?
yeah.
Because then people are supposedly living their best lives because
Right.
they're curating this story of themselves that isn't real,
Right.
And so and so that even further distances us from each other, right? Because then we just reinforce this sense that there's something wrong with us because everybody else seems to be living their best life,
Right.
And you're like
Exactly.
you're
And
like,
here I
no,
am
man, that's
just
not the
fumbling
yeah,
along. Yeah.
exactly, right? So I think like that's the goal of the book was really not only, like I said earlier, now you tell my story, but to be able to, raise a great catalyze conversations about like, hey, well, what is a not what's the meaning of life, right? I mean, I think that's the wrong question. What's a
Yeah.
life of
What's it
meaning?
all about? Yeah.
Well, what's a life of meaning for you, right?
Sure.
And then being, and then taking advantage of your agency and your choices, which most
Yeah.
people don't have, to really lean into that. And a lot of times, what that looks like is going to be different for everybody. But I do think a lot of times that slaying the
Well, no, you
dragon of
nailed
the
it.
ego can help.
Happiness and joy is really the one thing you have control over, and that's about it. You have the choice to be happy or not, and find what does that for you. And it's so many people get lost in all these other external factors, and there aren't any. It's
Right, right. They get lost in the shoulds, and then
yeah,
there's a disconnect. And you're like, then the part of the question is why do you believe those shoulds?
right.
Right? Like, why are those things the things that you think are going to make you happy? Like, like you said earlier, what really does make you happy? What
Yeah,
brings you joy?
right.
Right, man, lean into that.
Exactly.
It may not
More of
get
those
you on the
things.
cover of Time
Yeah,
magazine or, or whatever
right.
it is, but you might be you might be in a much better place mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and physically.
I agree. So when did you go from the realization to I need to write a book?
So I would probably about 4 years ago,
Okay.
so what was that, 2021, 2022? Yeah, I mean, part of what I'd been doing even before the seizures, I'd been given a talk down at the business school, University of Chicago Business School,
Okay.
um, in a friend of mine's leadership class that I jokingly called the accidental executive. And I was like, it was sort of this cautionary tale. It's like, how did I become a C-suite executive and hate my freaking life?
Right.
And it was sort of looking at these business school students who were so anxious and eager and saying, hey, I got everything that we're telling you you're supposed to get. And
Yeah.
I hated it. And so afterwards, people would come up to me and just like, hey, this part of your story resonated with me, or this part of your story resonated with me. And I realized it was an opportunity to, if I wrote something to maybe catalyze it, to do a number of things, right? One is to obviously tell my story. Two, to catalyze a sense of questions for people. And three, as my mentor would have said, give people permission to ask those questions, you know?
Nice.
And so that was the idea. And so then I started writing a few chapters, send them off, and fortunately somebody said, hey, this is pretty interesting. Why don't you go ahead
Nice.
and write this thing? And so, so I did. And I've always loved writing. So it wasn't like
Wasn't
it
sure.
wasn't, yeah, it wasn't a brutal, I mean, it was hard from the
Oh
perspective
yeah.
of, it's always hard to examine yourself and be honest with yourself. And,
Sure.
hopefully I was somewhat honest. And, it's hard to basically create a narrative that sticks together, right? Because life is a
Right.
set of series of, disparate things. And
Right.
you're trying to create this sense of this thread of like, oh, well, here's the thread that ties it all together. And,
Right.
it may have worked, it may not have, but, it gives me enough that I can sleep at night and get a sense of, okay, well, this is where I've been, this is where I'm at, and this is where I'm hoping to go.
I love that. So when was the book published?
It came out August 4th, so it came out last
Oh,
week.
it's brand new.
Brand
Wow.
new. Yeah, it just came
Beautiful.
out. Yeah,
And
yeah. So
how's it being received?
it's hard to know, right? I mean,
Right. Yeah, it's a little
like
early.
it's
Yeah.
a little early, I mean, there's touch of gamesmanship with these books,
I
right? I
know.
mean, first you got to get the testimonials from important people. And it was funny because I was
Right.
joking with a friend of mine. She had won the Pulitzer Prize, and she great, grace, great, she graciously wrote me a blurb for the back of my book, but
Right.
I joked with her. I said the whole book is about not defining yourself by achievements, but the only way I can get somebody on the back of the book is if they've got a big achievement. I'm like, there's
Right.
something really messed up about this, and then you got to get all your pals to put things on Amazon and reviews.
Right.
And so who
Yeah.
knows? I mean, my feeling on this has been, I just throw it out into the world and see what
Sure.
happens,
Well,
and
hopefully our listeners are gonna take a shine to it and we'll go. So, Sonny, you've got a very interesting story. Your background's incredible. You're obviously a very talented, gifted person, as you mentioned. Do you have one thought that you could leave our listeners with that would kind of sum up your position here?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I keep going in circles in my own head, I mean, I guess it's not a thought, it's a question, which is just to be asking yourself, I guess it's two questions, you know. One is, what are you chasing and who told you those things were worth chasing?
Hmm.
And two is, and two is around your sense of worth, where are
Hmm.
you tying your sense of worth to? And whose voice is whispering in your ear when you're doing that? Those are probably the two things that I think if people are going to
Those
walk
are
away
some,
with. I'd love for them to think about. And
sure.
and these questions there's never an end to the answer, right? We're constantly, but the challenge is to give yourself the grace and the space to basically explore those periodically. So maybe you don't have those massive inflection points where you feel like your life is completely out of alignment, that you're constantly readjusting in a way that feels more natural. So
Right. But that's even better. Professional athletes do it every day, right?
every day, right? And you got to look at it and you got to adjust, right? And I think that's part of what we don't do for ourselves many times. And like I said earlier, we just kind of get into inertia, and then we
Right.
wake up and we're like, oh shit, this isn't where I wanted to be. And so,
Well, how do we find your book and how do we get in touch with you and all that good stuff?
well, easiest way is just sonnygarg.me. So SONNYGARG.me. And that's my website. And from there, you can email me or you can get a link to the, different places to buy the book, whether that's Barnes and Noble's, Amazon, my publisher. And look, I love hearing from people. What I love doing is this, Joe.
Love it.
I love having conversations. I love just
You.
talking and meeting new people. And so, I'm jealous of you. 400 episodes. That's great. You got 400. No, I mean, it's 400 people you've been able to
I
help
just
shape
do
your
what I
life
like to
and learn
do.
from.
Yeah,
Yeah,
luckily
exactly.
they
So
come to
I'm
me
open
all
for
the
any,
time.
I'm happy to talk to anybody anytime. They don't,
Wonderful.
they don't need to have a podcast or anything. I just love meeting and talking to folks. So hit me up on the website and we'll see where it goes.
Beautiful. Well, listen, I'd love to have you back maybe in 6 months or so and see how the book's doing and see how you're doing. I love
I would
having
love that.
guests to come back and kind of, follow along. I have, like I said, I've had 400 episodes, probably about almost 300 guests. So we've had a lot of returns and
Wow. Yeah.
really a great relationship. Every time you have a conversation with somebody, you have a choice. What are we going to do with that? And so I like to see if we can build on it. So
I love that. And Joe, tell me, where are you located?
I'm in Southern California between LA and San Diego.
Oh, nice. Beautiful.
Yeah, and
Beautiful.
actually I have a botanical garden and a nonprofit called Gardens of Hope, and we do what we call therapeutic horticulture out here. So people come to the garden for
Wow.
retreats and things like that, and
Beautiful.
a lot about healing. That's what this whole thing's all about, healing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. And then I think there's different avenues and pathways, right? And what
Lots of
we've
ways to
learned.
get there.
But the most important way is to get out of your head.
Exactly.
The first
Exactly.
step is getting out of the left brain and letting yourself get into the right brain.
I love that.
And if you could do that, you're on your way. So
Well, this has been another episode of the Healthy Living Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Grumbine, and I want to thank all of our guests for making this show possible, and we will see you next time. This has been another episode of the Healthy Living Podcast. We produce this show so that people can share their stories, people that have overcome obstacles, people that are undergoing obstacles. We're building a community of health-minded individuals. If you're interested in supporting the show, please leave a review on the platform you're listening to it on. If you're interested in becoming a guest, please send an email to itsjoegrumbine@gmail.com, or you can send a note into the notes section of the podcast. All right. Well, thank you for supporting this show, and we hope you've enjoyed it.